Welcome. I even broke out a Christmas sweater in order to read this story. The story comes from 2012 and it was first read at the 2012 Christmas Eve service. The name of the story is Roger and Hank. This was the most unlikely of places, and these two men were the most unlikely of friends. A quick glance at the two of them would immediately remind you of Abbott and Costello, the old comedy duo. Roger, the one who looked like Abbott, was tall and slim, a man who looked like he had spent his entire life wearing a suit and tie. Hank, the one who looked like Costello, was short and stout, a guy you would not have been surprised meeting when you walked into the service bay at a local garage. Yep. It looked like Abbott and Costello, but without the funny. They had almost nothing in common. They disagreed on all the big topics, politics and sports, and the biggest of all, religion, which was odd because Hank's job was all about religion. Hank, the one who looked like Costello, was the pastor of the local community church, and he'd been living in this small town for about 2 years, and it was at the tail end of a long and seemingly unspectacular ministry career. He always joined the mid-morning crowd at the coffee shop in the morning, but he came back almost every afternoon, a little after 2, with his laptop in tow. And he would sit over a cup of coffee and work on his sermons for an hour or so, enjoying the solitude and silence of the then almost empty coffee shop. Roger, the one who looked like Abbott, had been here for only a few months. He had made the habit of coming to this hotel coffee shop every afternoon around the same time for a cup or two of Irene's coffee and to read through the newspaper. He had tried the morning coffee crowd, but in the mornings the cafe was jam-packed with blowhards and know-it-alls, the boisterous senate of this small town who proclaimed loudly and certainly about each and every topic. It made him nervous, especially since he was a newcomer to this place. He had arrived in early summer, having moved to this small prairie town after reading an ad about a house for sale in the newspaper in the city where he had lived all of his life. On a complete whim, he had taken a drive out to see the house, and to his own great surprise, he had closed the deal in a few hours. And within a week, he had settled his affairs in the city and had moved lock, stock, and barrel to this town. He still wasn't sure about small town life, but to his great surprise, he found that he loved this cafe with its thick mugs of surprisingly good coffee. Pastor Hank and Roger usually sat at opposite ends of the cafe, Hank engrossed in his laptop and Roger leafing methodically through the newspaper. Often they were the only two in the place, but other than the occasional nod and greeting, they never really talked. They worked and read and drank coffee in silence, the only noise coming from Irene, who would bring them refills. Irene's mother had opened this place when the hotel was built back in the 50s. Irene now served coffee and provided really honest and great tasting food during breakfast and lunch. Afternoons, though, were very quiet, but she kept the place open so she could do some food preparation for the next day, and she still served coffee to whoever happened to wander in. She was by nature a very chatty person, but seemed to respect the solitude of these two men. One day, around the end of September, an event occurred that drew these two men together. The event, of course, was the one thing that they could agree on, the weather. At about 2:30 that day, it began to snow, and not just a little autumn flurry, but one of those freak events where the snow started to come down really hard. As Hank stood up to leave, he had to walk right by Roger's table, and they happened to look out the window at the same time. Hank said, "Wow, that's quite the snowstorm for September," and Roger said, "It sure is." And with that, the ice was broken. They introduced themselves, and the very next day, in the midst of the slush and muck of the rapidly melting snow, they actually said hello to each other when they came in. The conversations increased in length and topic until a new pattern was established. After Roger finished reading the paper each day, Hank would close up his laptop and go and join Roger for a final cup of coffee. The relationship deepened over the months. Hank was as open as he could be about his life, and while he found Roger quiet, at least Roger was a good listener. Hank told Roger about his life as a pastor and all the places that he and his wife had lived. He told Roger about the churches that he had served in, the good and the bad. And even though Roger had never really been a church person, he found himself interested in Hank and in his life. Roger seemed to really enjoy Hank's good-natured stories about church life and about his own shortcomings. One day, Hank was on a roll telling funny stories, and when he got to the one about sneaking into the washroom during the prayer time of a morning church service and forgetting to turn off his lapel mic, Roger actually laughed so hard that coffee came out of his nose. Roger, on the other hand, was very guarded about his life, and at first he didn't share very much. After some gentle prodding, Hank eventually discovered that Roger was a city boy and had worked first as a high school science teacher and then later as a school administrator in a city school division. Hank also discovered that Roger, in a sense, had fled to this small town after suddenly losing his wife to cancer late last spring. He had left his 2 grown daughters and their husbands and his 3 grandchildren behind in the city. Roger was very reluctant to talk about his family or his wife's death, but Hank was patient and did not demand answers. Well, an odd thing happened during those autumn months. These 2 unlikely people became friends, and these afternoons sitting in the cafe, drinking Irene's excellent coffee, quickly became the highlights of their weekdays. Hank was smart enough not to ask Roger to attend church. Roger had never seen the need for religion, and while he was open to talking about things that interested Hank, he made it clear that he considered religion a crutch for weak people. Hank accepted, of course. At the beginning of December, Hank began talking about Christmas Eve and what he called his favorite service of the year. As December dragged on and it became clear that Roger was determined to spend Christmas alone, Hank asked him to attend. Roger hemmed and hawed, but would not commit to coming. Pastor Hank did not resort to begging, but it was close. Finally, 2 days before Christmas, Roger agreed to attend, but told Hank that he was still reserving the right to back out at the last minute. Sensing that this was as good as it was going to get, Hank left it at that. And so, Christmas Eve arrived, bright, cold, and crisp. The kind of day when your boots crunched in the snow and the vapor of your breath seemed to hang in the air forever. Roger had only himself for company that day. Hank was over at the church getting ready, and the coffee shop closed right after lunch, so Roger really had very little to do except putter around the house. Made himself a pot of coffee, watched a little TV, and read a few chapters in a novel. And he thought about his life the way it was now. He remembered the way that it used to be. You see, after 35 years of marriage to his best friend, he had at first been very angry when Sylvia had been taken from him so quickly. That's why he had fled the city, taking early retirement, selling his house, and moving to this place. He had steeled himself to the pleas of his own daughters and done what he thought he needed. And after all these months, he tried to decide if he was still angry about Sylvia's death and decided that he really wasn't anymore. What he was instead was just plain sad. A sadness mixed with loneliness that made his chest feel like it was full of cannonballs. But what really made him sad was how prophetic his wife Sylvia had been. She often told him that his greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. He had a stubborn streak that had lifted him out of poor circumstances, and he had accomplished quite a lot with his life. He had earned his own way through university and gotten his teaching degree. He had risen through the ranks, first as a teacher, then as a vice, and then full principal, and finally into the district office, eventually becoming the superintendent. That same stubborn streak had also caused him a lot of grief with broken relationships and a complete mania to do things his own way. Now, that terrible stubborn streak had him here in this small town, in a house he had bought in a snap decision, far away from his daughters and his grandchildren, and all because he wanted to be alone, to wallow in his own grief, to grieve the way he wanted, all by himself. But added to the sadness was another emotion that on this day would not go away. At first, it was elusive and unnameable, but as Christmas Eve day wore on, it began to identify itself. He'd felt that emotion the first time when he picked up the phone to call his oldest daughter. And it was this emotion that kept him from punching in the numbers. It was what forced him to put the phone back down. This emotion kept him from reaching out to his own children. And he was finally able to identify that emotion as shame. For the first time since Sylvia's passing, Roger came face to face with his own shame. He recounted every bad decision that he had made since Sylvia's death, how each one piled on top of the previous one to lead him to this day, Christmas Eve, all alone in a place where he had no friends. And the truth dawned on Roger. He did have a friend, Hank. Of all people, Hank. And because he had one friend, Roger decided that he would finally, for one of the first times in his life, do something for a friend. He stood up and got ready to attend the Christmas Eve service. Roger got to the church a few minutes before 7 and tried to sneak in and sit at the back, but there was Hank, grinning like a demented monkey, pumping his hand and leading him up the aisle and ushering him into a seat near the front, but right on the aisle. Well, Hank never said a word. He just winked and walked away to finish getting ready for the service. To say that Roger felt uncomfortable was an understatement. First, it had been many decades since he had been in a church. Secondly, he knew no one in the building other than Hank, although he suspected that the woman who was playing the piano was probably Hank's wife. And glancing back once, he finally did see one person that he knew. It was Irene, sitting a few rows behind him, and when their eyes met, she smiled and winked at him. What's with this town and with all their winks, Roger thought. Well, the church was nearly full, which Roger knew must have been a great thrill for Hank. The inside of the church was warm and inviting. It had been tastefully decorated for Christmas, and on the platform at the front was a rough-hewn manger filled with straw. So the service began. Hank led the service and seemed very pleased that so many people had come. He led the Christmas carols, and much to Roger's surprise, he felt himself singing along. There was a special reading by a young family, and a couple of people sang some special songs, including one old gentleman who played We Three Kings on his harmonica surprisingly well. As the service drew near to a close, Hank went up to the podium and announced that the conclusion of the service was simply going to be reading the Christmas story from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Hank sat on a stool, and the lights grew dim, and he began to read. Roger was surprised by the strong and loving tones of Hank's voice as he read about the angel visiting Mary and later Joseph. He found himself being drawn into the story, one that he intellectually understood but had never really thought about. And Roger began to wonder about his Frank and why he had given Hank and why he had given his whole life's work to an idea that there was a God. But hearing Hank tell the Christmas story was so passionately and beautifully gave Roger an inkling that perhaps this story was important. When Hank got to the part about Mary and Joseph traveling to Bethlehem, there was a bit of commotion at the back of the church. Two young children, a boy and a girl, both dressed in bathrobes, began to make their way up the aisle. The girl had a pillow under her robe, making her look pregnant. As the children made their way down the aisle and past Roger, he was shocked to discover that he recognized the faces under the towel headdresses. It was Jared and Zoe, his grandchildren. Zoe looked him in the eye and smiled, but never broke step as she and Jared bravely made their way to the manger at the front of the church. And once they were seated around the manger, a woman came from the side and placed a young sleeping child in the cradle. And there was no question as to who that woman was. It was Roger's youngest daughter, Michelle, and the baby was undoubtedly her 4-month-old son, Josh. Roger was stunned. Could barely take his eyes off of his grandchildren. What were they doing here? How did this all happen? He glanced over at Hank, who was continuing to narrate the story, telling the miracle of the Christ child and how he came to be the Savior of the world. Their eyes met, and while he read, without even skipping a beat, Hank winked again, this time with a tear in his eye. At that same moment, Roger felt a hand on his shoulder, and he looked back to see that his oldest daughter, Christine, was sitting behind him along with his 2 sons-in-law. After Hank finished reading the story, the congregation rose to sing Silent Night. And as Roger stood up, something happened. All of the anger and grief and sadness and shame that he had kept bottled up inside of him broke loose in a tidal wave of emotion. It seemed as if every tear that Roger had refused to shed since Sylvia's death, 9 months worth, all came blubbering him out of him in 5 minutes. Roger stepped out of his seat into the aisle and fell into his daughter Christine's arms. And by the time the song was done, they had been joined by Michelle, his sons-in-law, and by little Mary and Joseph and tiny baby Jesus in a massive, wet, crying, sobbing, laughing, hysterical group hug right there in the middle of the aisle. And no one in that little church seemed to mind one bit. It turned out that both of Roger's daughters were here for Christmas. Their minivans packed with decorations, presents, and groceries for a great family Christmas and dinner the next day. And just before they loaded up the kids for the quick trip to Roger's house, he found his way to the front of the church. Roger waited patiently until Hank had finished wishing Merry Christmas to his parishioners. And when they had a moment, Roger stood in front of Hank. You did this, Roger said. Why? I didn't do anything. I just contacted your daughters and they did the rest. It's all on them. And Hank's reply faded away softly, and there was a long pause. And finally, Roger said, with tears in his eyes, "You saved me, Hank. You saved me. You lowered me a rope when I was drowning and you pulled me up. I know I will never be able to thank you enough." Then Hank looked up at his tall friend and found that he couldn't contain his emotion either. "It really wasn't me, Roger. I've been praying for you from the moment I first laid eyes on you. And God loves you, Roger, and so do your kids and your grandkids. I just was trying to point everyone in the right direction." And by this time, Roger was weeping openly again. Through his tears, he reached out his hand to Hank, and there was more unsaid in that handshake that could be said in 1,000 conversations. I don't know many preachers, Hank, but in my mind, Roger said, you are the best ever. Maybe it's time we started talking about this religion thing. And as Roger walked out the door of that little church to join his wonderful family for Christmas, he called back over his shoulder, "Merry Christmas, Hank. See you in a week or so. Tell Irene to keep the coffee hot." And that, my friends, is the end of the story.